Thank you very much. And before I get started, I want to introduce my wife, Carol, sitting over here. She has a lot of jobs. She has a lot of jobs in the campaign and has had a lot over the years. But right now, her principal job that she's very proud of, and I am too, is she has an important job of taking care of some new twins in our family. Our youngest is senior in medical school and trying to graduate, so she's been doing a fair amount of babysitting. And it never takes much of a twisting of an arm. She probably has a picture that she has shown half of you already. But it is real nice to be here, and I've enjoyed it very much, and I'm delighted to visit with so many who have helped, not only in the last campaign, but over the years. And I know that some have visited the district and certainly have helped financially, which makes a difference because you cannot work in a vacuum. Even very wealthy people who have a lot of their own money that finance their own campaigns don't necessarily win elections. So I think you need a philosophic base and philosophic support. And if you are running for an office such as a congressional seat, and the Republican leadership is opposed to you and the Democratic leadership is opposed to you, you have to have some resources. And fortunately, they did come about now almost 2 years ago, and we were able to make our point. The next point we have to make is to make sure that we can vote in a consistent fashion and gain the credibility that will allow re-election, so that we'll find out later this year. But it is a real pleasure to meet with and visit with and spend a weekend with philosophic allies. It makes it a lot different than what you put up with elsewhere. Today, in Washington, things are, a lot different than they were, and they're the same as it was. And in some ways, nothing ever changes. But the Congress definitely is better in the sense that there's better rhetoric. There are some good intentions, but the results aren't a whole lot different. Unfortunately, the results are very much the same as before, because government is still getting bigger and taxes are still going up, and there's not a whole lot of serious discussion about constitutionality and morality of law. And so we really haven't quite reached that point of addressing the fundamental changes that need to come about. But in the country and around the district and Texas, I think there is a definite difference, and I think that makes me feel better about what's happening. This weekend, and of course for me, the last several months, high on the discussion list has been the issue of Iraq. And I heard a news commentator the other night. A woman came on and she was explaining. She says, "Boy, were they surprised, about that rally in Columbus." She says that was a real shocker. That really caught the Clinton people off guard. And then she's told a half-truth. She says, back in Washington, she says there has been absolutely no discussion whatsoever about the possibility of somebody having a position against the bombing. Inside the Beltway, the only thing they've talked about has been, should we bomb a little bit or bomb a lot? And in a way that's true, except she didn't listen to a few particular speeches that I had given. But mostly this was true. There were the debate was generally the Republicans and the conservatives were basically arguing for a lot more bombing. And yet I think that even the media missed it. Hopefully I was closer to being attuned with what was happening in the country, because I do go home frequently and I've been talking about the issue, and I don't get any resistance to this position. So I think they were caught off guard, but I don't think they necessarily should have been surprised. The votes in Washington, a lot of times are predictable, and sometimes, it's rather discouraging. One of the questions I get asked, and I was asked this several times here, is why do things work out the way they do in Washington? Why do these members act like they do? And that isn't always, an easy answer, because most of them, I'd have to say, are fairly well motivated. I think they don't go there with the distinct purpose of doing harm. But I think when it comes down to understanding basic economics, they don't have a lot of wisdom, and they go on and they continue to make a lot of mistakes, and yet they're rather complacent about it. But they do not have a firm belief, firm convictions, and they do not remain determined. The other day, these members, I want to just tell you a couple stories about how the members react to give you an idea on how this operates. The other day, I was riding on an elevator, and one of the freshman members, the one that just went into Congress a year ago with me, had expressed an interest in talking to me. So he came over. He says, "Ron," he says, "tell me," he says, "I want to know something I can be passionate about." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You're passionate about everything." He says, "You feel so strongly about everything." He says, "You got to give me something to be passionate about." And I said, "Why don't you be passionate against war?" We were talking in a group, and was in a sort of a closed session, and there was some leadership there, and one of the Republican leaders came up and was explaining his philosophy about government. And he says, one important thing is that you have to understand that if you stand on principle, you go nowhere. So that was his way of operating, and it is true to the degree. If you want to go somewhere in the hierarchy of the leadership position and in Congress, if you want to do something in going somewhere in preserving liberty or preserving a country that we love and preserving something for our children, then I think it should be a different story. But the attitude is one that is perplexing at times. Last summer, there was the great debate on the IRS. We saw the hearings, and they had this great revelation about how horrible the IRS was, and it's conventional now to badmouth the IRS, and I think that's great. In the 70s, when I was there were only about 6 or 7 of us that would endorse a resolution and a constitutional amendment to abolish the IRS and the income tax. Now, the chairman of Ways and Means will say, let's get rid of the income tax, and everybody goes home to their districts and they bash the IRS. At the time they were doing this and we were getting these good hearings in Washington, all of a sudden we had a bill come up, and it was the Treasury bill that included the IRS. So I looked in this, and here they had a $550 million increase in the IRS budget. So I asked him, why are we doing this? And then when it came back from the conference, when the Senate dealt with it, it came back from the conference, it went up to $729 million. But the explanation was that, yes, the IRS is bad, but we still have to collect revenues, And this is the way Washington operates. There's a bit of deception at times, and they deceive themselves. With all their wonderful intentions, they will even deceive themselves. We had a piece of legislation dealing with a token effort to improve public education. Now, that's a difficult job from Washington, D.C., but it had to do with allowing a tax deduction for the interest earned on a savings account for education. Not on the principal that you put away. It wasn't a deduction. It was only on the amount of money you were making. You didn't have to pay taxes on it, and you would save this up and use it for education. Well, it really adds up to very, very little. I mean, it wasn't even a deduction. Now, my proposal has been that under the current system of big taxation and a weird tax system, I said, give everybody in this country that has a child that they want to educate $3,000 tax credit per child. Now, that's my proposal, but of course, the immediate answer for that is that costs the government too much. You know, if we give you your money back, the liberals think that's a cost to government because they work on the basic assumption that they own the fruits of all your labor and they are in charge of how you spend it. And but this one bill that was very, very token, and I almost rejected the idea of being a co-sponsor because it was so puny and it was leading people to believe it was very helpful. But I put my name on it. I became a co-sponsor, and it floated around the committee for a bit, and then it came to the House floor. But the night before it came to the House floor, they rewrote the bill, and they put a new number on it. And basically, the reason they rewrote the bill was they had to work into it a way to pay for it, because this again was going to be a cost. So they raised taxes twice as much as the benefits that might come from these tax deductions for education. So when I got wind of this, I went down to the floor and I said, well, you know, I'm a co-sponsor of this bill. I like the idea that there's some competition that the American people get some tax money back, but you have a tax increase here, and that's not what we're supposed to be doing. And they said, well, we had to pay for it. And I said, well, you know, if you cut the NEA, the National Endowments for Arts, by 1%, you'll have saved more revenues than you're going to get by doing this, raising this taxes. And immediately, though, the leadership could not let that stand, because if you have that sitting out there, this might convince somebody that they're going to be voting for a tax increase. So they had to have the top-notch authorities come down and say, the gentleman from Texas is wrong. This is not a tax increase. This is not a tax bill. This is nothing more than closing a loophole to raise revenues. So I had to vote against my bill that I was a co-sponsor. Of course, it wasn't my bill. It wasn't worth it, hardly to begin with. But that's the way the place operates, and can become a little bit annoying at times. One member of our delegation, when we were sitting around mulling things over, and he let out a complaint, which I thought was significant enough to write down. He said, you know, he says, we have a problem. He says, as a minority in the old days, at least we read the bills and pointed out the bad things in these bills. He says, but you know what? He says, now that we're in the majority, we ignore this. And then later on, after the bill's passed, we have to answer to it. So he was longing for the old days when they were in the minority. And one other member said to me, he says, you know, he really doesn't want to be in the minority, because that's what motivates everybody up there, is just, you know, the power and the prestige and all. He says, boy, there are some days that I wished I was back in the minority, then I could vote like Ron Paul does every day. But their attitude is something that could be improved a little bit, to say the least. But you know, there's a lot. Of course, the biggest thing in the news right now is the deal on Iraq. But you know, this Kofi Annan that's going over there, the General Secretary. You know, he did something the other day. I don't know much about his politics. Of course, we can't complain about what he's doing right now, because he's trying to slow this thing up a little bit. But he said, he answered somebody in the media the other day that I thought all of us who are in politics ought to pay attention to it, especially American politicians, because he answered the media like no American politician ever did. They quizzed him a little bit about this trip. He was getting ready to go over there and make an attempt to stop the war. And this reporter says, do you think you're up to this? Up to this mission, you know? And he looked over at him, and, you know, he doesn't smile a whole lot. He looked at him and he says, what kind of a question is that? And I really thought that was fantastic. Sometimes that's the way I feel, with our own media. And maybe I'll use that someday. What kind of, when they really ask the dumb things, what kind of a question is that? Because we do get a lot of nonsense thrown at us. But, I don't know whether you feel sorry at all for the Clinton administration. I guess not too many people do, but sometimes we should feel a little bit sorry for them. But because here it is, here we had Hillary back in the old days. She was out there prosecuting, Nixon. And remember the old days when Bill Clinton was campaigning against war? Now here we are today. What is it? Time goes around, comes back, doesn't it? Here we have, the old haunt of Watergate on their doorstep and anti-war protesters. That to me is a rather amazing event. But I don't feel sorry for them. I don't know about you. I think maybe they're getting exactly what they deserve. During this, actually, I'd been talking about the war, the potential war, well before the break at Thanksgiving time, because I had thought maybe something would come up over those holidays, which it did not. But I went down to the floor, and we have opportunity to speak out on 1-minute speeches before the session starts. We can get time for a 5-minute speech at the end of the day, or we can, if we're alert, work hard to get a 1-hour speech on the special orders. And I've been trying to do is, I've been more motivated on this issue than most other issues. The IMF issue has been motivating me, but that all of a sudden is slightly less important than this issue of going to war. But I went down one day and gave a 1 minute, and there's a limit to what you can say in 1 minute. But my whole point on the 1-minute speech was that there was an inconsistency in our foreign policy. And I pointed out several things like our alliance with Saddam Hussein and our willingness to give him weapons and endorse use of poison gas and crossing borders. And pointed out that it might be wise for us to consider a more consistent foreign policy. Well, the next member of Congress got up, and he obviously did not know exactly what I was going to say, because I didn't know exactly what I was going to say. But when he got up, he immediately was able to use a quote that he knew by heart to make a pointed criticism at my suggestion that Congress ought to be more consistent in what they do. So he used the a rather well-known Ralph Waldo Emerson quote, which says, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines." And I thought that was rather amazing that he quickly did that. So the next day I was able to give another speech, but without making it personal or directed by name. I answered by making this statement. I says, criticizing another member for following a consistent freedom philosophy and strict adherence to the Constitution is more of an attempt to reassure the critics themselves who are uneasy with their own position. Obviously, criticizing one for consistency either means that pragmatism and inconsistency is something to be proud of, or there is little respect for the philosophy that is consistently being defended, a truth the critics are not likely to admit. I later on, a week or two after that, gave another talk and probably said the very same things again and talked a lot about the war. That same individual came up to me and complimented me about my speech. So I can't quite figure all that out, but I think nobody in Washington wants to take the position that they have a consistent philosophy and see that as a burden, rather than something that they would want to be proud of. So we will continue. The last summer also we had a vote on the foreign appropriations bill. And fortunately, the Rules Committee Chairman, Jerry Solomon, happens to have the same feeling about the United Nations as I do. And I think most people here would agree that there's probably no room for our membership in the United Nations. So he allowed me to bring up an amendment to the Foreign Ops Bill, and it was to get out of the United Nations. And during this, not too long after that, we had a famous American come forward and say that he would help out because those terrible congressmen weren't voting to pay the past dues on the United Nations. Of course, they claim we owe past dues, but they also don't take into consideration that we pay all the expenses for all this policing activity and this war activity, and therefore they owe us a lot of money, but those who want to still be in the UN might not want to pay the dues because they claim, well, really, we don't own it. But you know that Ted Turner now has offered, to come forward and give $1 billion, not a small sum of money. And I don't think he earned that in a socialized country. I think he earned that where there was a little bit of freedom left, and a little bit of capitalism. But he's offered this $1 billion. And I've been asked, they said, well, is that a good idea? Should we allow him to have it? I said, well, under the circumstances, it's an imperfect world. And it certainly would be a lot better if we had to have the UN that it was financed through donations. And that would be okay. But then we have another problem, though. What if we have a UN-sponsored war? And I thought, well, the only thing we can do there, that would be okay, too, as long as Jane Fonda is the first one to go and fight it. So, the business in Washington. The Iraqi thing is a major event going on, but there's another event that I think is very important that I want to touch on. And that is an attitude that's existing in Washington today that is a major threat to us. And it's the interpretation of the budget. And it's from the president on down to the leadership. And I, quite frankly, can't tell for sure whether they've deceived themselves enough to lie to themselves. But they sound convincing, and they've convinced themselves that the budget has been balanced, and they think that the people in the country believe them. That yes, look, we have balanced the budget, and look at these wonderful things that we have done, and they're talking about what to do with the excess. To come up with anything near so-called balance without a deficit, what they have to do is borrow like $185 billion from Social Security. So they take it out of Social Security, they bring it over here and they say, well, there was a $185 billion deficit, but because we get it out of Social Security, we don't count that. So the budget is balanced. And now, if they have $5 billion extra, they say, what are we going to do with it? And the big argument is, what are we going to do with it? And Bill Clinton said, well, we're going to do a little bit here, but then we're going to make sure we're going to save Social Security. There can't be anything more preposterous, except for one thing. What it does is sets the stage for the mental status there is they believe the economy is doing well, and we wouldn't argue that the economy is doing lousy, except for a lot of people that I talk to aren't as convinced. There's some people in my district who do not think the economy is doing quite as well as the government tells them. But they come in and they believe that the economy is going to do well forever. The budget is essentially balanced, and I think you're going to see one heck of a big year spending. I do not see any concern about overspending. And this is one of the problems that we have with this debate on taxes. There's nobody that would like to see less taxes and get rid of the IRS than myself. And yet, our bigger problem isn't the tax issue. The bigger problem is the spending issue. But if you do any poll, any place in the country, and most politicians are pretty good at reading the polls, every poll shows that people don't want higher taxes. Well, of course, when you're taxed 50% of your income, it's almost enough. So taxes aren't, it's not popular to say, I'm going to raise your taxes. Mondale, I think, might have been the last one who thought that was a good thing to say. So nobody's going to talk about raising taxes, and a lot of people are going to go along with cutting taxes. But they also know and urge, the political advisors caution the candidates and the members of Congress, don't talk about cutting spending because people don't like to hear that. And so there's not going to be any cuts. I mean, the spending is going to go up. There was this pretense that they were going to get rid of the National Endowment for Arts. You know, if there was any one agency that you should have been able to phase out, it should have been the National Endowment for Arts. Some people ask me, why don't you get rid of the Department of Education? And why is there no serious attempt to get rid of the Department of Education? I said, well, if you can't even cut 1% out of the National Endowments for Arts, how are you going to get rid of the Department of Education? And, there was a token effort to cut a little bit, but last year went back up again, and all these programs were raised last year, and they're getting ready to spend a lot more money. And I think the agitation going on in foreign policy is going to be justification for more spending in the military as well. So there's not going to be much of a serious effort to cut back. But on the Iraqi situation, it is something that I have dealt with and dwelled on and preached on and for several months now. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time, of course, on the morality of what we're doing as well as the constitutionality. We all know what the Constitution says about who gets to declare war, so that's not a complicated matter. But the other argument about the war is sort of the pragmatic and the practical argument. You know, how many bombs you drop and when, and what are your targets, and all these ramifications. But the practical argument seems to be swaying more conservatives right now than the arguments of that over the years, and the constitutionality. And I've argued that over the years that this doesn't the moral and the constitutional arguments are probably the weakest arguments to use in Washington. That they don't respond to this very well. I did notice, though, after talking a little bit about this in Washington, some of these questions have drifted into some of the town hall meetings, and they've been asking very specific questions about it. My idea of what I would consider a moral war is one that is fought for national defense, for national security purposes, and it should be very clear. And I think the founders understood this, and this is why they abhorred war and thought that we should not get involved in entangling alliances, and that it should be with by the will of the people, by the vote of the House and the vote of the Senate, and not by a president. And we did pretty well on this until World War II, as far as at least going through the procedures. It was explained rather clearly today that a lot of gimmicks are used to get us into war when the people don't really want to, and how we're manipulated into war. That was the procedure prior to World War II. But since World War II, it's been done in a different fashion. It's been done much more openly and blatantly unconstitutionally and illegally. I mean, ever since the Korean War. The other night when I was on Crossfire on this, I was impressed with a look of surprise from Bill Press. Bill Press was quizzing me, and he was pushing me on this, and he was absolutely convinced that he would trap me into inconsistency by saying, yeah, but what about the Korean War? And I said, when I was preaching that it should be declared, and I said, well, it shouldn't have been fought. And it shouldn't have been, certainly under those conditions. And he was caught off so much off guard. All of a sudden, he immediately went to another subject and did not come back with that. But obviously, whether it's the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, or all the other little wars that have gone on since then, they're unconstitutional, they're illegal, and they're immoral. And yet there's not much of a desire to resume this notion that we should be voting a declaration of war. Now, right before I left, because the subject was getting to be a hotter subject, I introduced a resolution, and the resolution simply says that he cannot go. Bombing is an act of war. And he cannot do this. He cannot initiate bombing. He cannot initiate an act of war without the consent of the Congress, without a vote of the Congress and a declaration of war. Now, this was a bit of surprise because all of a sudden, this was different. The only time we came close to anything like that is when they withdrew the funding for Vietnam. But this would be essentially prior to the killing, to make them live up to it. But in a way, it's sad that you have to do this. If we lived in a constitutional system of government, it wouldn't even be asked, that question. Can a president march off and start bombing people 10,000 miles away and killing thousands of people with the potential of a much bigger war without the consent of the people? Now, we have to bring it to their attention and suggest that that's a reasonable question and that we introduce resolutions. So we have gone a long way from following the rule of law. And we have to get back to that because the Constitution is supposed to mean something. If it doesn't mean what it says, what good is it? So our whole purpose is trying to get people to live within the rule of law. The fact that I've introduced legislation to get out of the UN, I think, is significant. The fact that the IMF bailout is coming up and I want to be out of the IMF, it's important to realize that now it is said, and George Bush really set the stage for this in a much more aggressive manner, because I can remember very clearly when many of us in this room were fighting this prevention or an attempt to prevent a war and killing 7 years ago. George Bush says, you can vote in the Congress, but I'm going because I have the authority from the United Nations. Now, if that shouldn't wake the American people up, what will? I mean, what does seem to wake them up is the fact that we have had troops now serve under UN commander and foreign generals. That's starting to wake up the American people. It's starting to wake up the American people the fact that there's some jurisdiction by international bodies like the UN coming into our national parks. So the people are starting to wake up. And maybe the fact that we were even able to get this to a vote means that we are gaining some strength. But even Bill Clinton now is not asking. He wants the resolution passed to give him a little bit of political cover, but he says he really doesn't need it because that resolution passed back in 1991, right before they went into Iraq before, is still in existence. So it's an open-ended declaration of war against Iraq that's been going on since 1991. And they argue this with a straight face, and it's the law of the land, that it's permissible, and that the UN gives us the authority to do these things. Well, this can be rather serious. This can be rather serious business because, and it's a lot different. It's a lot different over there now than it was before. Today we live under circumstances not like they were back when there was a so-called invasion and an occupation of a neighboring country, which Lou pointed out last night it was not a legitimate thing. There were a lot of questions about whose borders and whose oil it was. But the countries over there today are giving no support to what we're doing. I think there's been several events and several declarations that cannot be ignored. One is Hussein, I believe, might be smarter than Bill Clinton. I think he might be. Has it ever dawned on you, or did you ever think it's a little bit weird? Let's say we were thinking on their terms. That's hard, but let's just imagine that we're into their thinking about war. Why is it that we're threatening to bomb them to kingdom come at the same time we double their allotment to sell their oil? I mean, this is what's happening this week. They've doubled the allotment, and they say, well, you can sell more oil. Well, it seems to me that, I mean, if Hussein might say, well, it looks like I'm winning this thing. You know, I'm getting to sell more oil. But anyway, the Arab nations are united like they've never been united before. Hussein was smart enough to release all Arab prisoners, all foreign prisoners from all around, no matter what their crime was. They've all been released. He has sent an ambassador to Syria. He hasn't been talking to Syria for 18 years. And they're getting much closer. He's about to sign a peace treaty with Iran. He's talking with them like they've never talked before. They have now talked about supporting or being supportive and opposed to the Americans bombing in Iraq. So the Islamic fundamentalists have exactly what they've been looking for maybe for 1,000 years. Sometimes I think we can compare this to another crusade, another Western crusade to go in and impose our will, whether it's the Europeans, but it's now the Americans. And if there's ever any understanding of the Arab thought process, I mean, we are doing everything conceivable to support the enemy on what we're doing. And then we turn around and we have a military that is admittedly weak. You know, I keep thinking that what we might be doing, you know, in the old days, the slogan on the conservative side was peace through strength. Of course, you know, a lot of us have a different attitude. It wasn't our military strength that made the socialist system fail in Russia. But peace through strength, that at least sounded better than what we're doing today. We have war through weakness. This is what we're doing. We're militarily weak. We don't even have troops over there. Even if he decided he had to invade somebody, he can't invade. He doesn't have the troops. We have a weak policy. We have weak allies. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Over the years, we've had accidents happen. Sometimes we put people in harm's way and men get killed. And then we argue for decades on who did the killing. I mean, who sank the Maine? You know, that's a good question. Could it have been possible that our side did it? You know, it's possible because we got to fight a war and that's what they wanted. Could it have been possible that we encouraged Pearl Harbor and on and on? But then there could be accidents that happen too. We could do things deliberately. There could be some accidents. And although there's not this intent to invade and march up and risk land troops, people think this one might be less risky than the last one. The last one, they say, turned out not so badly. You know, a couple hundred men got killed. 30 to 40,000 are still suffering from Persian Gulf War syndrome, but we have been able to keep that quiet, and the CIA and the Pentagon know how to cover their tracks. So we don't count those people who may suffer and die some other time. But accidents can happen. And I am always suspicious and wondering about naval events. Think about it. You know, it was the Maine, it was the Lusitania in World War I, and then there was Pearl Harbor, sinking of ships, and then the Gulf of Tonkin. So what do we do now? In an age when if you really had to fight a war with a real enemy that had real technology, probably one of the most old-fashioned weapons are surface vessels on an ocean. So what do? We put them in the Persian Gulf, where it's a very narrow strait, where they might not get out easily if all of a sudden somebody gets upset with us. And they're liable to get upset with us. And who knows what might happen. Somebody might stage an event. Even Hussein may stage an event. What if he uses a nuclear device on his own people? And then the Arab nations say, oh, the United States just dropped a nuclear bomb on some little, town over there. I mean, can you imagine the unity? If they're unified now, what's going to happen when something like this happens? What happens when one of the missiles hits Israel? Could happen. It did before. Israel has made the announcement they will not hold back. And there's no real trust in the management of a Bill Clinton and in the military if we really get into a military battle. What happens if the Iranians decide to use some of their missiles? I'd been concerned about this. I wrote a letter to the Defense Department and I asked about the vulnerability of our Navy in the Persian Gulf. And they wrote back, and I think they tried to be honest about it, and they said, no, the danger isn't all that great. We have anti-missile missiles. So if the missiles come in, we can knock them down as long as there aren't too many. Well, how many is too many? If 200 come at one time or 300, how many do the Iranians have? And what if the Chinese get involved? So I don't know whether, I don't think we're going to have the Third World War start next week. But I think it's possible that we could start something very, very big, something that is unimaginable. At the very same time, we're dealing with something else that is imaginable if you've studied monetary policy. And that has to do with the currencies. So we have a crack in the dam, so to speak, in the fiat monetary system in the Southeast Asian currencies. But nobody's too worried about that. The markets seem to be handling this quite well. But we have a monetary system that is based on a system of money that is very shaky. And it can become undermined. So we have this IMF, we have a financial crisis, and we have internationalism involved there because we're going to bail them out. Then we have the Iraqi thing, which is under UN command and UN orders and a international conflict. At the same time, even in another category, which is a serious event going on in Washington, it has to do with the scandals. And I'm not necessarily thinking of the one that's the most popular. Because the resolution that I am a co-sponsor of was introduced prior to the Lewinsky scandal. And the resolution is Bob Barr's resolution that said that we should have an inquiry into the possibility of the impeachment of the president. And yet, there's another scandal. The main reason why we introduced it had to do with the really illegal use of the FBI. I think Nixon looks like a pretty clean guy compared to what this guy's done with the FBI. Went to prison over that. So that is being shoved aside. And then another event that motivated me to put my name on this inquiry had to do with foreign interference in American politics. Foreign investment in our political campaigns. Chinese money, Indonesia money. Coming in here, and then all of a sudden the many stories about the conflict of interest. I thought that was enough. Matter of fact, I think the Lewinsky thing is almost a distraction from the real serious things that, will probably be or could be impeachable, where these others will probably never be provable, and they'll probably be able to tie them up, but distract from those particular events. So you have this internationalism involvement in corrupting our politics. We have the IMF, which is requiring that we bail them out on a financial system that could become very unstable, as well as this unstable condition we have in the Middle East. Now, if in the 1970s, under attack and challenges, the Arab nations came together and boycotted the oil, is it conceivable that they would feel motivated to do that again? And you say, oh no, they're making a lot of money, they're selling us the oil, and we have moderate governments. Moderate means pro-Wall Street, pro-Western moderate governments in Saudi Arabia and other places, and they would never turn. But what about the people? It's not the governments. The governments actually would go along with this nonsense. It's the people that they fear. The people in these countries are saying, we're not going to put up with it, and we're liable to throw you out of office, and there'll be a rebellion in this country if our leaders go along with it. So those leaders, if they are motivated enough not to chime in and go along with the Americans' bombing of Iraq, could they possibly go along with an embargo? We're more dependent on oil than ever before. Now, the markets would obviously disagree with me on that because oil prices are crashing. But that doesn't mean things couldn't change overnight. But I think the potential is there for major, serious problems. Now, what is the overriding issue? Well, the overriding issue to me is the issue of liberty. Because whether it's the financial system collapsing and causing chaos in our country, or whether it's a war, it's always a threat to liberty. Already, you can understand very clearly and read about it daily in the paper about the collapse of the financial system in Indonesia. in particular, the standard of living goes down rather rapidly. Jobs are lost, and the people get very angry, and they do not understand economics, and they're impatient. And they must blame somebody. Right now, they're tending to blame America because it's our policy that comes through the IMF, and the IMF is not free market, and they're imposing free trade on everybody. And they go over and have all these conditionalities. The people get angrier at us for the problems, but the Indonesian people, the poor people, are breaking down stores and looting. Who are they after? The wealthy. Who are the wealthy? The Chinese, and they're running them out of the country. So there is a scapegoat. So there is a definite consequence from this. But the threat is liberty. Because whether it's the chaos that comes from economic problems or the taking away of our liberties under wartime conditions, the ability for our president to declare emergency powers are unlimited. And it's quite capable. If it happens, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people in this country said, as a matter of fact, they've been predicting, they said Bill Clinton is going to stage all this so that they can make declaration of emergency powers. I have no idea whether it would be deliberate, but I think it's a possibility that if you have an economic crisis and a currency crisis plus a war crisis, that Bill Clinton wouldn't hesitate for 1 minute to make a declaration of an emergency and have dictatorial powers. So it is a very serious business. Now, there are two major leaders who are behind what we're doing in Iraq. Bill Clinton, as well as our good friend, his good friend, Tony Blair. And they're the great Western leaders. I guess Bill Clinton is the moral social leader, and Tony Blair is the philosophic leader. But I have a quote from one of his visits when he was over here visiting Bill Clinton, and he was explaining to us what he really believes in, and this is rather startling. Tony Blair says, I tell you, a decent society is not based on rights. It is based on duty. Our duty to one another. To all should be given opportunity, from all responsibility demanded. Now, whom do you think he wants duty to? He wants duty to the state. Is what he wants. And he said rights aren't important. And a decent society is not based on rights. I mean, he says this. And all I can say is if you want a decent society, you have to have one where there is respect for rights. That's the only decent, fair society that I want to live in. Not one that is based on his concept of duty to the state. The 20th century, probably the forgotten cause in the 20th century has been liberty. We have been living on what others have given us, what our founders gave us, the understanding of many of the 18th and 19th century philosophers, and the concept that you should have freedom of choice in free markets. And we still have a fair amount of that, although the foundation has been eroded. Although there is still some competition going on in some production, we have a currency that doesn't work very well, and we have a foreign policy system that doesn't work very well. But we have concentrated on the materialistic part of society, not on the principles of liberty. And for this reason, we have allowed these principles to be eroded. And the great threat and the great challenge is really, are we going to defend them once again? Everything I see in Washington is directed toward the material benefits of society. Whether it's the big corporations or the big banks or the poor people coming in for food stamps or the farmers coming for bailouts, the whole works, they're always coming to prop up the material benefit. Corporations are very good at hiring good lobbyists. A good lobbyist is good for their business. Better than donating to the institutions that promote liberty. So their investment, they see that their benefits are much greater by investing in the destruction of liberty, and they concentrate on the material. So our challenge is very great. The purpose of all that we do, whether it's through the educational groups or whether it's through the political action, the purpose ought to always be for the defense of liberty. When you live in a free society, then we all can work to solve our problems. We have less problems. We don't have the state to deal with, but we have then a greater abundance of wealth. We have a greater abundance of free choices. We have less problems. But when the state gets involved in solving our problems, making people act better and live better and do things better and make sure everybody has economic equality, then it squelches out, it eliminates the purposes of liberty. You can't have it both ways. So we must once again define that the role of government is for the purpose of protecting our liberties. Liberties that come to us not from our government, but from a natural way or a God-given way that they come to us, and the purpose of the state is to guarantee that nobody can trample on us and take them from us. And today, I thought Reverend Rushdoony's comments were very pertinent, that we were moving into an era. I tend to agree with that. I don't know anything about timing, but it is true that I feel strongly enough about this that I believe that running for Congress in 1996 was a time where I would be in a place, if it was to be that I'd be elected, I might have a chance to talk about the problems. So I anticipate that we are rapidly moving this way. I did not anticipate nor predict that it would be possibly with a war, but I've thought more along the lines of social breakdown here as well as our economic problems. But the job is very clear. The goal is very clear. We have been blessed in this country with a great nation, and we must do something more. To do less will mean that we will not have our freedoms. To do more will not be difficult if we can get the people to do it and get our priorities straight. And I want to thank you very much.